Welcome to the OC24 podcast, where we've taken some of the best talks and discussions from this year's 24-hour conference on global organised crime, which showcases some of the most interesting research into organised crime around the world. This episode is called Graphic Narratives of Organised Crime, Gender and Power in Europe.
All right, let's get started. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this panel on graphic narratives of organized crime, gender, and power in Europe. My name is Frederik Byrn Køhlert, and I'll be moderating the session today. The panel is inspired by a forthcoming book, also entitled Graphic Narratives of Organized Crime, Gender, and Power in Europe, by researcher Felia Allum and artist Anna Mitchell, which will be published in next spring by Routledge in a series I edited on gender, sexuality, and comics. As a creative graphic narrative, the book tells the story of 5 young women involved in different forms of criminal organizations and activities in Europe. And doing so, the book not only raises vital questions about the importance of gender when analyzing organized crime, but also gives a voice to these women to show that they're not purely victims, but also have their own agency. In that way, the book questions the dominant lens so far used to investigate, collect, prosecute, and analyze organized crime that focuses solely on the men in these organizations. So in today's session, we'll first hear from one of the book's co-authors, Felia Allum, who will talk to us about the motivations and methods behind the book. And then we'll invite our other panelists to comment and also open up the floor to questions. But to begin, I'll just briefly introduce each of our panelists here today. So first we have Felia Allum, who is a senior lecturer in politics and Italian at the University of Bath. And she's currently a Leverhulme Major Research Fellow. She also is on the steering committee of the European Consortium of Political Research's Standing Group on Organized Crime. She's the author of Camorristi, Politicians and Businessmen, The Transformation of Organized Crime in Post-War Naples, and The Invisible Camorra, Neapolitan Families Across Europe, which won the International Division of the American Society of Criminologists Distinguished Book Award. Next, we have Kate Thomas, who is a senior research fellow and a senior Swan project manager at Birmingham City University in the UK. She specializes in interdisciplinary qualitative inquiries into gender, inequalities, and contemporary higher education, with a particular interest in spatial theories and creative methods. Kate also uses graphic social science practices and research poetry to disseminate her research. And finally, we have Brittany Gilmer. Brittany Gilmer's research and teaching focused on the relationship between the illicit, violence, territory, and structures of power. She's particularly interested in experiences and intersections of violence and care, and is currently working on a book about women's role in maritime piracy. Dr. Gilmer is a former consultant with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime and the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. So thanks again to everybody for joining us, and I will hand it over to Felia.
Thank you very much, Frederik. Thank you very much for joining this session. Unfortunately, Anna can't be with us today, but what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to go through some of the pages, some of the pictures, some of the graphic narrative in order to be able to describe the process and some of the thinking behind what happened. Okay, so this is not the front cover, this is the inside front cover, because Routledge imposed on us a front cover, a hard front cover, which we decided that we wanted a separate inside front cover. So this is our front cover. And this project I've been working on now for 4 years, and I'm very grateful to the Leverhulme Trust for funding this project, and also for Thames Valley Violence Reduction Unit, because when I won this grant to undertake a comparative study of the role of women in different criminal organizations across Europe, this particular project, this particular output was the one that I feared I wouldn't be able to find a home for. So I'm very grateful grateful to Frederik as editor of Routledge Studies in Gender, Sexuality and Comics to actually give it a home, because it's a very unique piece of work within the sphere of organised crime, it seems to me, and also very different in terms of the main aim and objective of this particular work is to translate academic findings into pictures and into a narrative and into a story. So this is kind of an extra to what I'm doing at the present. I'm working on a manuscript to put together the academic channel, the academic findings, but I also wanted to find another way of expressing those particular findings. So the project I'm looking at the moment, as I said, is a comparative study of the role of women in organised crime. And there is literature on this topic, but it's very limited to a certain extent. It's kind of challenging. So just to put you into a kind of overview of who I am, if you don't know me, my work so far has been focused on Italian mafias, in particular the Neapolitan mafia. And I've looked at the Neapolitan mafia and how it moves out of Italy, its relationship with politics, always interested in the relationship or its relationship with women, or how Italian mafias treated women. And now I'm kind of opening up that debate to look at different types of criminal organizations. What seems to be clear when we look at the literature on organized crime in general is that it tends to be very male focused, male centric, and we talk about a male only world, a macho world, where women have a specific role to play, or they're seen in a specific way. I talk about a male gaze because it seems very kind of, how can I say, men are predominant actors and women are subordinate players and have a very little role, or if they do have a role, it is either a sexualized role or one where they are exploited or marginalized. And this kind of came across in the general literature. So the main project and what I'm trying to do is to collect research to give a voice to women, to try and capture their stories, their lived experiences, in order to be able to see whether this is actually the case. There's a lot of history on gender and the role of gender in terms of a category of analysis, which I think is really important and which I think we've tended to forget. In other words, when we look at organised crime, we have so far tended to add women on as an extra, or to use the subtitle of this book, we've used them or discarded them as footnotes. In other words, they're not seen as important actors. They're not seen as having a role to play or a role that is worthy of our attention. So this research, in a way, is kind of trying to challenge all of that and trying to challenge that male gaze to say that perhaps we need to look at this again. Perhaps we need to engender the study of organised crime to understand that women are just not discarded footnotes, are just not an afterthought. So the research journey, as I said, I feared this would be more difficult to actually place in terms of where it could be published, but also it's much more challenging research because it's not just collecting data and telling a story. It's collecting the data, it's analysing the data, looking at the different topics that come out, and then also sitting down and having a two-way exchange with an artist, so that there is then the artist who takes on and assimilates the ideas and then develops the research and puts into her own vision. So we've had this kind of three-level process, one where I've done my usual kind of collecting data, mixed methods, semi-structured interviews, ethnographic work, collected the material. I've tried to then put it together as simple as I can for then Anna to take it on and to have a look at it. So the stories that we tell, we've changed the names, we've changed some of the details, but the majority of the stories, in particular the protagonists in these four stories, in these three stories, are women that I was able to interview in different kind of context. And I wanted to focus on specific lived experiences to show what was important about their experiences, but also to show that they are part of a bigger criminal picture, that they're part of a geography of organised crime, and gender is very much within that. So this book is trying to raise awareness that women are not marginal figures, that women are important within organised crime, and that we must understand that, you know, men cannot be and should not remain as the basic unit of analysis, and that we've got to go beyond this idea of universality of men, and that women's experiences are very, very important, because otherwise we tend to fall into some kind of stereotypical jargon and stereotypical assumptions about what women do and how they live within the world of organized crime. So I really think that we have to see, and I hope that in these stories we see women and young girls as active agents of history, but also as active agents of their own lives and their own destinies. In some cases they will be exploited, in other cases they have choices to make. So it's kind of a journey, and as I said, what I've tried to do and what we try to do is to reproduce and very much keep to the voices of these young women who shared with me their journeys and their kind of difficult lives within the sphere of organized crime. So what I'd like to do now is to give you a sense of the different stories. The first story was the more difficult and challenging story, which was to focus on West Balkan women, Albanian-speaking organized crime, and where women were within that, within those difficult and different structures. And although I was able to interview a victim of human trafficking, and I was able to collect information and data around different Albanian-speaking drug networks, it was very difficult to get really close to that specific community to really understand what was going on. So we transformed that first story into a more general story about how one defines organized crime, how one studies organized crime, and how one can really try and figure out what is going on within, in particular, the West Balkan setting, because West Balkan / Albanian speaking organized crime gets a lot of bad press. It's very difficult to know exactly what it looks like because the police data at the first level of analysis is not as clear as it should be, or is very confusing, and the picture is not very clear. So let me share with you a few of the slides that tell the story. Here in particular, two young women who I come across and talk to about their experiences of human trafficking, but also another young woman who was related to a drug importing group into the UK. As I said, this story was particularly difficult, and it was very difficult to actually get very close. So it's more grey to a certain extent. It's more vague in how we talk about those specific women, and therefore it's more about me trying to open up and trying to understand the more complex issues around studying organized crime and trying to get close to this phenomena to be able to talk about its particularities and its complex nature. So here, the first story is very much more about me trying to unpack what organized crime looks like and how we talk about organized crime and how we try and really get a sense of what it looks like. And gender, I would argue, is not taken into account at all, and therefore researching it is much more difficult, much more frustrating, to say the least, because the police data isn't there. So we need to find alternative strategies to try and identify what the women are doing. And also, I think through my research is to also sort of move away from the fact that women don't have agency and are agencyless, and move towards the idea that women are victims, there's no doubt about it, but they also have a certain amount of agency. So here it's just trying to set up, it's trying to show the difficulties involved in defining specific ethnic groups, and that we mustn't stigmatize these specific groups, and we have to try and understand how they move around and how they become a global force within a local context and vice versa. I find it very difficult that we give labels to groups nowadays when we live in such a global world where communities, and we have first and second and third generations of communities, therefore it really doesn't necessarily, is not very helpful to give a specific ethnic or national label. So here, this is kind of the Albanian story, trying to kind of unpack how Albanian groups have moved away perhaps also from prostitution to investing in more hard core activities such as drug importation, with the blessing of the Calabrian mafia. So this story is, I suppose, kind of, as I said, it's less about the voice, but more about trying to put the kind of context, and then finally trying to understand that organized crime is complex. Women are within that, but we have to look at it. And we also must not stigmatize certain communities. A right-wing press clearly pick up at the moment. We can see in the UK, the whole kind of migrant and smuggling, it's all about organized crime, rather than looking and unpacking and seeing that it's much more complex than that. And it's not about necessarily specific ethnicities. So these are the kind of pictures that we've put together in terms of trying to go away from this kind of hyper tension, but also this kind of myths and stereotypes that there are around organized crime, and it's kind of us against them, etc. And it's much more complicated than that. And there are much more structural conditions which can help us explain what is going on. So this is the first story, which was, as I said, the more complicated story, because it's the one that we had to put together, and we had to find a kind of way forward to try and explain what it was. Whereas the three other stories were much more linear, in the sense that I collected the story right from the person telling the story, and therefore it was much easier for us to sort of follow their journey within the kind of bigger organized crime network. So Kimi, for example, I interviewed back in 2018, 2017 in the south of Italy. She was a victim of a human trafficking by Nigerian cult groups, by Nigerian brotherhoods. And she explained her journey quite nicely to me on how she was conned into coming to Europe. She didn't really feel that she kind of knew or understood what she was going on. Some academic literature suggests that women know exactly what's going on. Obviously, I think there's space for women to know, but there's also space in the case of Kimi, where she only slowly started to figure out what was going on. She only slowly started to understand what was going on. So here, Anna has used a completely different technique to represent the journey across Africa and the trouble and the thinking process that Kimi has. And what I found in particular was important for me in Kimi's story was the way that she described her madam, the way that she described the journey, and the way that she described the strength of the madam, and also the realization that perhaps the madam had previously been herself a victim of trafficking, and also perhaps had been a prostitute in Libya and then in Europe. So here we have a completely different style, where it's very much about Kimi's story, about leaving a little village just outside the capital of Nigeria, where her father decides that she's no longer going to school, and therefore, you know, the only thing that she is good for is to be given to this woman who promises her a job, who promises her another alternative life, and she believes in that. She genuinely believes in that, and then slowly she sees that the madam is not what she's made out to be. There's problems at home. There's her father's not very kind to her mother. There's a lot of sort of issues around the family, and therefore she's only too happy to leave. But then she also realizes that when she arrives in Libya, that it's not exactly what she was expecting. What was important for me in this particular story is the way that she describes the juju ritual which is used by the Nigerian brotherhood groups, the Nigerian cults, to how can I say, enslave young men and young women into eventually paying a huge sum of money to try and get out of their debt bondage. This religious ritual where they have to swear that they're not going to run away, that they're going to fully pay their debt, otherwise their family will be punished, was really kind of very strong and powerfully described to her. And we tried to sort of also try and get that right in terms of this kind of religious ritual where these young women really gave their souls to this and completely believed in what was taking place. So this again was the idea that this young woman was waking up to understanding what was going on around her, and the story kind of comes to an end where she has to make a decision. She arrives in Lampedusa, and in Lampedusa she's put into one of the Italian kind of migration centers where they receive people who manage to get across the Mediterranean, and she has two paths in front of her. One where she has a telephone and rings the telephone number she is given, because she's been given that number by her madam in Libya, and she has a future waiting for her. Or a couple who tell her, they're from Guyana, and they tell her what's going to happen, and they say, if you use that telephone number, you know what lays ahead. You're going to carry on into this life of prostitution, and you're going to carry on being a pawn within this bigger game. And so she manages at that point to make a clear decision not to go there and to reject this whole system. I must admit that when I interviewed her, she was still slightly sad about it all, because she felt that she needed to take that lie. She needed to go and meet the new madam in order to be able to get her arrested, because she felt that what she did, her decision saved her, but didn't save other young women from being put into that situation. the third story is a story of a young woman who is caught up in the drugs, the county lines, the drug running and drug delivery across the UK. Again, this was a story that was collected in London by me one afternoon, where I was able to talk to a young woman who recounted her love story with a young man who promised again the earth, and who promised to show her that she would have lots of money, that she would be free, that she would have a good relationship with a young man, because at home it wasn't a safe place. And it all goes a bit sour, and all of a sudden this kind of form of exploitation and entrapment happens. And we therefore follow the story of Rosie, who is a very young 14-year-old who is not happy at home, who finds her friendship group as being a very valid place to be, and she then sort of gets taken in and eventually put into a trap house where she will sell drugs for her supposed boyfriend. And she also manages to escape. She also manages to understand what is going on and how and where she is placed within that kind of criminal structure, to be in that vulnerable space and where she is being kind of exploited. So again, here the images are of exploitation, of manipulation, of young people trying to identify or trying to find a safe space, because home is not safe, but it's not safe. So it's only a question of time before she manages to escape. And she's very lucky, and she clearly says that she's very lucky to escape, and that there are a lot of young women in her situation that will not escape, who will be trapped, who will be raped, and who will be kind of manipulated and the victims of harsh violence. And the last story, which is a more familiar one for me in a certain way, is the story of a mafia boss's wife. In particular here, I'm referring to the Neapolitan Camorra. I was able to interview Rita in Turin. She became a collaborator of justice, a state witness. So she was very open about recounting her story and her life choices, because she decides in the end to turn her back on the organization of her husband, to turn her back on her husband's organization, and to break with the Camorra, the Neapolitan mafia. What's interesting in Rita's story is that she is an outsider. There's a lot written by academics about being born into a mafia family. Clearly in Calabria, that's obviously more the case. Here in Naples, there are a lot of examples of women who marry into a mafia family and who then take on the role. And in this case, it's not so much that Rita took on the role of her husband. She was very much his partner in crime. She followed him. They were young together. She was finally arrested, I think, at the age of 26, 27, when she'd led the clan for about a year and a half. And people said she stepped into her husband's shoes. I would argue that she was already with her husband and was very much a partner in crime. So in this story, we try and kind of again represent the chaotic nature of Naples, to really draw out how the contexts are different between the women as victims, the women as being kind of exploited, and then the women who have their own agency. And in this case, Rita very much has her agency to decide the choices in front of her, and to either carry on within her criminal path, or to decide that, you know, it's not really for her anymore, and she wants to liberate herself from the pressures or the potential violence or death of a rival clan. So again, here we tried very much to kind of give a sense of the chaotic nature, and then we have a state prosecutor who comes and makes her realize that she does have a way out. Death is not the only way out for her. She can, in actual fact, remove herself, take her children with her, and also try and get her husband to accept her decision and to follow her. Now, in this case, He didn't follow her. They never spoke after. They only saw each other in court, and they never spoke, and he never followed her, and he's still in prison. In another interview that I did, the man followed his wife. She said, you know, this is the only way, very much in love, very much kind of, and he follows her. And he followed her very much to the end, because she had the strength to say this is the only way forward. And the two dynamics were interesting. In one case, the husband wasn't able to break and didn't follow his partner, and in another case he was very much able to follow his partner. So each case is different, each case is very nuanced, although we can also find some recurring themes. But the Neapolitan case and the Italian case in general, I think, really is quite important and interesting, because it shows the agency of women in a positive light to a certain extent, that women aren't only victims, and not only being controlled, and there's not only a question of coercive control. Clearly in the other stories that is the case, but here we have full agency, where women have a voice and they're respected and they are taken seriously. So just to wrap it up, what I wanted to show, and what we wanted to show in a different medium, obviously the book is very expensive, so it's not necessarily going to be seen by loads of people, but we hope that it will be able to be accessible through libraries, to sort of turn the discourse on its head and challenge the assumptions that we have about gender roles and binary gender roles, to automatically assume that women are less important than men. And I think that in all the cases, women are more than just discarded footnotes. I think that there is much more an element of partnership, of co-decisions, rather than women being purely victims, footnotes and extras. And I think criminology for a long time has, you know, kind of still, like society at large, I would argue, had this male gaze, and either hasn't wanted to or has not been able to move beyond that. And I think I'll stop there. I hope I've made some kind of sense, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thanks so much, Felia. That was really wonderful, a good walk through the book. And perhaps I should say that although the series that the book will be part of was not really set up to accommodate comics as such, right? It was set up to accommodate more traditional scholarly work on comics and graphic narrative in different forms. But when Felia approached me with this project, I just knew right away that would be a really exciting contribution to the series, because of this very sort of unique way of weaving scholarship together with visuals. But I'm wondering if Kate or Brittany would like to maybe comment before we open up for general questions from the floor.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you, Felia. That was absolutely fascinating. That was I really enjoyed that, and really, you know, so many kind of things to think about and connections coming up. So my background is that I've recently published what I've called a graphic novella called 5 Survive Lockdown, which holding it up. There it is, and which is based on the experiences of 5 female academics in 5 fictional female academics in a fictional UK university during and just beyond the first UK COVID-19 lockdown. The women represent 5 sort of academic career stages. They're from diverse backgrounds and with diverse circumstances. I self-published that in September, and so one of the things that particularly struck me, one of the first things that Felia said, was about worrying that she wouldn't find a home for this graphic narrative. And yeah, that is a real for an academic piece of work, that is a real challenge, because the formats, you know, the formats are quite different, and so for me as well, there was a sort of a time critical nature of the piece. So it was about the first lockdown, which is already now receding into our collective memories, and has been, you know, replaced by other lockdowns and restrictions and variants, etc. So I kind of really wanted to get that piece out. But yeah, that whole sense of finding a home is a real challenge for people engaging in in graphic narratives within an academic sphere. The other aspect that really resonated with me is your talk of co-production with, sorry, was it Anna?
Anna
Mitchell. And that way that you'd had that two-way exchange with about the work and then her interpretation of that, and the slightly different styles that we used throughout, which I really loved. What I found was that I got to a point, I sort of jumped into my project without really thinking it through in terms of its implications, and realized that I didn't have the technical skills or capacities or equipment to move it on from pieces of Bristol board basically and pencils and pen. And so I also engaged in a sort of co-production with a professional illustrator who transformed the pieces into, well, straight lines for a start, which I seem unable to draw, and but also tonal variation and clarity, and then these kind of PDFs that could then go to publication. And that was a really rewarding process, and a really I remember just being absolutely stunned when the first one came back. It was like it had taken it on and moved. It was my work, but it was much better. There was more to it than there had been before. So that was really exciting. The final thing I'll say just at this point is what I also found really interesting about your presentation was that discussion about the visuals of the presence of the researcher within the piece. So you were very much positioned as the academic researcher, as the academic in this, and the kind of knowledge producer, if you like. And I think that's also a kind of perennial question for anyone who's working in this form. Where are you in the work? And I've tried both, with being there as a researcher in a previous much shorter work, but also I saw myself in this piece as in my novella as very much as the observer, as a narrator, but as a commentator through the graphic media as well. So thank you very much for that. That was really fascinating.
Great, thank you so much, Kate. Brittany.
Yes, first of all, I want to say thank you to Felia for sharing this, and also Kate sharing your experiences as well. I haven't done a graphic novel yet, but it's definitely something I'm interested in. So I just wanted to speak more from a criminology perspective, and for someone who researches women in crime and justice. And I just want to say, I feel like this is the perfect time for this type of medium and this type of topic. I feel like criminology as a discipline is expanding. Obviously, we have more research on feminist criminology, but I think also with this expansion into more interest in transnational crime and crossing of borders, I also feel like people are much more open and accepting to this type of medium with graphic novels. So when I read this, it reminded me of, I've used, V for Vendetta to talk about, terrorist anarchism. I've used murder of Emmett Till to talk about, race and crime. And I feel like this is such an important addition to this growing body of crime graphic novels. I have a bunch of chicken scratch on this paper here, so I'll try to kind of work through it. But when reading this, the visuals were so powerful to me. I feel like you really did a great job of emphasizing not only the diversity of agency that these women had, but also the strength. And I feel even though they were victims, you could see through the artwork and their words, because in graphic novels, you have to choose the words carefully as well, right? Because they're small and they're supposed to be powerful. And I think you did a brilliant job of that, because I felt even the women that were victimized were very strong and resilient. I also thought what was very interesting and I think important, and especially the Nigerian case study that you talked about, just because I do my research in sub-Saharan Africa, I feel like this type of medium, the graphic novel, is also such an important tool for cultures that are mostly oral cultures, or also perhaps might not have a high literacy level or English speaking. Someone in these cultures, or they're generally marginalized in criminology research or anything, now have an opportunity to look at these. And I would love to hear, after I'm done, rambling on, about if you were able to share this with the women you interviewed at all and their feedback. So I think it's bringing research to a population that doesn't necessarily look at this type of research. Also, I think within the visual format of these books, it really does a great job of demonstrating or creating an illustration of how complex the spaces, the movements, the different the networks and borders and practices that are all they play a large important role in these transnational and organized crime networks. And you can read about it, but I think when you actually see it in all of these different pages, it just really, it comes alive. And I think it adds a whole different level to the study of organized crime. And then I also wrote here the pathways to crime. We've studied pathways to crime a lot, but again, I think the visual, and just when you were talking about the marriage into these organized crime networks, or even like the travel on the boats, like, again, I think those are missed when we read academic papers, but they are right there and they are centered in these graphic novels. And I think that's so important. And then I will just end on it, open it up. But I feel like this graphic novel format is so important because it really shows that crime doesn't happen in a vacuum, that these crimes are influenced and impacted by and are basically co-constructive of the cultures they're in. And Juju is a great example, because in human trafficking discourse, every now and then they'll talk on Juju, but I don't think Juju is really understood on how that operates and how important that really plays a role. But again, you cannot miss that when you read that story. It's so important. And, the other victims, like you said, you said that, just speaking now, the woman that was, she felt obligated to go back and help the other victims. Again, I don't think we hear about that enough in victimology studies. And then lastly, just societal norms, gender norms, marriage, culture, all that stuff is captured so well just in the drawings and the conversations that you chose. And I commend you. It was so well done. And I'm so excited. Everyone in my house was trying to peek over me and read it while I was reading it. So I'm excited to see it come to print. So again, thank you for this opportunity. And I will be quiet and open it up to whoever else wants to talk.
Thanks so much, Brittany. And just to, I guess, pick up on what you were saying about the ability of the form to sort of really spatialize or visualize these kinds of networks, these kinds of contexts that organized crime happens in, right? Like there's an ability to really juxtapose that on the page in really interesting ways. And I think that Felia and Anna really managed to do such a good job of using the form in a way that is, I think, actually quite unique. Like it's not, like a superhero comic. It's not drawn in any sort of way that looks like a recognizable sort of mainstreamy type comic, but drawing on some of those comics techniques, and then also sort of mobilizing Anna's very beautiful, detailed, realistic visual style. And I think the end result is really, really wonderful. Anyway, thank you so much. So let's open up for questions or comments. So someone, one of the event organizers put in the chat here that if you'd like to ask a question, please just raise your hand, and I'll be able to unmute you, and you can ask your question.
Before that, can I just respond, Frederik? Can I just make a couple of comments? Just make a couple of observations. First of all, thank you both for taking time to have a look at it. And Brittany, you'll be my first on my list to send you when it's published. Hopefully, it'll be published in April. Responding to Kate and that idea of agency and the presence of the researcher, it wasn't our intention to do that. It's just the way that the Albanian material didn't come together as much as we wanted to, all of a sudden forced us to sort of say, right, okay, then you're now going to have to put yourself at the front of it and sort of lead it in. And we had this kind of conversation about, it was a good way to start, because then it let, the kind of material, then the stories take on their own. But I'm not sure retrospectively, though, I think it was the best thing that could happen, because I think that, as you say, it's the difference between your voice as an academic and writing in a kind of academic pedantic way, and that being considered great, and all of a sudden here having a voice in a different way, where, as I said, it was very much co-production. Anna, I was very lucky to know Anna at the point when I was sort of starting out, and we had these conversations. So by the time it kind of looked like a more serious project, she'd already done one story. In particular, that's why the local violence reduction unit came on board and were very interested in trying to take the kind of young woman experience, because we're not talking about young women who are being exploited by these drug lines at all, to sort of be able to unpack that and look at all the kind of forms of exploitation, the forms of vulnerabilities. And so I was lucky that the conversation had already started for me to go back and say, look, I've just interviewed this lady, how do you think we can look at it? But it was really kind of very much co-production. There is a lot of Anna within that. It's not just me. There were my corrections of going, no, there were certain words, there were certain things that I just thought, no, that doesn't work. But there was a continuous kind of co-production, rather than, I do see, and it's a different way of doing it, of somebody just handing over and saying, right, you do what you want with it. Whereas for us, it was this continuous kind of exchange, conversation, her coming back and saying, I didn't understand that. What do you think? Do you think that looks right? But the fact that we had the lack of Albanian material meant that all of a sudden, that was the only way to sort of be able to sort of get the story to start somewhere, by having an academic going in and sort of, well, let's talk to policymakers because they'll listen to me, and etc. So that kind of worked out kind of quite nicely. And the other point I think is it's difficult because, and you know this as well as I do, Brittany, is the idea of agency, and the idea where I talk about the male gaze more and more now, and I'm not new in talking about it. I'm not in reinventing the wheel, but it just seems to me that in criminology, and I'm not a criminologist, I'm a political scientist, so I'm coming from a different angle, but it's just about the way that the men see the world. And I know that a lot of people are revisiting, like you're revisiting the Somali pirates. A lot of people are revisiting by saying, let's turn history on its head and let's look at it from a gender perspective, where are the women? And it just makes it look, all of a sudden you're asking different kind of questions. But it's obvious that we also have to deal with the idea of victimhood, and we also have to deal with the idea of domestic abuse, and where do you put that within the picture of agency, because women are clearly victims of domestic abuse. So are we saying that they don't? And I noticed that one of the questions says, oh, how do you deal with the violence of men by women? I don't want to disregard that. I think that's important, but I think that we've also kind of not talked enough about women having their own agency, women making decisions, women being important actors, and being empowered to make decisions and have influence. So when I look at the Italian mafia, it's always about the men, and then if you go and sort of take a closer look, actually there's a mother, there's a wife, and why is it that they're less important than the man, when in actual fact, without the women, the whole thing collapses? So it's a really difficult space for me, because I acknowledge the importance of domestic abuse and violence and these vulnerabilities where men clearly are exploiting women, but at the same time I think we're undervaluing the power that women have as free agents, not to have their agency and to have their influence on male decisions. So it's a really difficult, I think, space to sort of navigate, but I think it is about kind of terms like voiceless, terms like hidden, terms like agencyless. It's all this kind of we're ignoring the women, we're kind of not thinking they're important. And I think across our generation is starting to say, hang on a second, if we take a closer look, there's a woman. If we take a closer look, there's a daughter. All of a sudden, where the time is right for us to take a kind of, recontextualize or rethink those processes to say, is organized crime just male? Well, in Naples, it's not. I mean, it's a fallacy to say that, but we carry on saying it because it sounds good, and Saviano's Gamora's come out series 15 or whatever, and it's just the women aren't there and they're there, and I just sort of think that's really kind of a complex picture to negotiate. I'll stop there.
All right, thank you. Well, maybe I have a question actually that I don't think I've ever asked you, Felia, and that is how did you hit upon this idea of creating this work, and how did you I guess, I don't know, how did you established this relationship with Anna, and sort of how did that come about? Were you inspired by any particular works that you had seen, or was it sort of an original idea of yours to create this unusual format?
I don't know whether it was kind of coincidence of a coincidence of elements that kind of came together. It kind of came together of kind of talking to Anna, who was a local artist, and trying also to communicate and translate academic findings into different mediums. So I'm not an artist. I mean, Kate clearly is more, is interested in art and is a good artist and can put these things together, whereas I wasn't an artist. But I sort of think that through videos, through different kind of mediums, we can try and kind of get people to be interested, to understand the complexities of it, because an academic article is what it is. Even an academic book, it's trying to make it more relevant, but at the same time, I think sort of trying to unpack the stereotypes and the myths and the kind of easy kind of black and white pictures that we have of organized crime, when it's actually very nuanced and it's very kind of complex. So it kind of came through conversations, and then I noticed that it is something, I think, in academia, especially in the UK, that is becoming, I wouldn't say fashionable, but relevant. People are turning to graphic narratives, graphic novels as a way of trying to communicate and make it more accessible to a bigger public. So it's kind of a combination of things, of coming across various things. At the same time, I mean, as I said to Kate, I was worried, and Frederik was very positive in responding to this sort of little email that I sent saying, this is what we're doing, and what do you think? Because what I think will be really refreshing about the book is that it'll only be comic, a comic narrative. It will be only a graphic narrative. And I think that in a way, Routledge have also been very kind of brave to take it on, because I don't know whether they realize what's coming, in the sense that there's no text apart from the pictures that we've put on that page. So it is kind of taking it to a different level, and that's what we wanted it just to be, just drawing and pictures. So it was more a kind of conversation of things, of trying to see how we can use different media to sort of make people think about organized crime, the dangers of organized crime on the one hand, and how stereotypes sometimes are not useful.
Yeah, I mean, well, from the point of view of me as editor of the series, it was really I was surprised at the ease of convincing Routledge to go ahead with this project. They were really on board right away, and even though it required them to sort of like change production practices and really sort of like think a little bit outside of their usual ways of doing things, and but they were really game, and I think that really speaks to I think also what Brittany was talking about, how this is a form that is sort of gaining traction and is becoming more and more seen as a sort of alternative, valid way of presenting academic research.
Having said that, if you'll recall, one of the reviewers was extremely negative about a non-cartoonist attempting something like this. It was just clearly there was the negative. There's always one negative, but it was very harsh, saying, if you are not a full cartoonist with qualifications in being a cartoonist, then you shouldn't touch this. No one is allowed to go there if you haven't got the skill. And I think that in terms of the content, they didn't get it, and I thought they were very kind of negative about the pictures. Do you remember that reviewer?
Yeah, no, of course. And I think that was in part a reaction to Anna's style, which is not a traditional sort of comics style, but I think it works so incredibly well for this particular project. I think that was the misunderstanding of that reviewer, was that they were expecting I don't know, like a Garfield type style, or like that kind of like more cartoony visual representation, which is just like sort of the extreme opposite of what Anna ended up doing. And so yeah, there's always a negative review, I guess, but we're happy to work through that. I think we we also learned something from that review, right? And so definitely.
No, definitely. But I also think that perhaps graphic narratives and cartoons can also be very adapt, as Brittany said, to more marginal topics, to topics that we might not necessarily shine a light on, sort of mainstream things that we need to go and have a look at a bit more detail. And I think that then we can widen it out and kind of really shine light on all the different aspects, whether here it's exploitation, vulnerabilities, poverty, or it's kind of, drugs economy, human trafficking. And I think that that's what the beauty of this is, that it kind of simplifies it and makes it kind of clear while dealing with some really kind of harsh, brutal and violent topics, if you see what I mean. And I think you're right. I think that it kind of, it really kind of shines a light on some things that, in an academic book will be a paragraph, at the end, rather than putting it at the main kind of in the middle of the conversation.
And also puts an actual visual face on these discarded footnotes, right? Like presents the reader viewer with an actual face with which to engage with, right? And I think that's really unique that the form enables that. We have a couple of raised hands here from both Kate and Brittany. So maybe Kate first.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. I'll just lower that hand. I just wanted to respond to something that Felia was talking about, complexity and ways of communicating, disseminating, representing complexity rather than a sort of binary in data. And that was very much behind my motivation to create 5 to Survive Lockdown, because actually what I'd done was an piece of institutional research within my university, a survey, an online survey, because we were in lockdown, about the experiences of living and working through lockdown. It was to all staff, not just female staff. And I was expecting, maybe 100 responses, and I actually got nearly 600 responses, which for a qualitative researcher is slightly overwhelming. And what it meant was that in order to, properly analyze that data, I had to engage with statistical analysis and someone who was expert in that. And what I got out of that was a very statistical kind of report. 70% of people found this challenging, 3% of people found this challenging, and of which, and then looking at the gender aspect then. And that was fine. And that was, obviously fantastic to get that kind of response. But I personally felt that I couldn't relate to the data. I could see it. I knew that it was valid and all that kind of thing. But for me, what was missing from that was complexity, was the affect of that experience, those experiences. And I wanted to somehow, I wanted to portray that as well, because we can read a report and recognize its import, but then we can put it aside. Whereas if we read a story, then we can engage with characters, we can engage with narrative, but you can still talk about the same issues and themes, and so actually for me, creating the novella was a continuation of data analysis. Actually, I see creating a graphic narrative as a form of data analysis. I do other kinds of data analysis as well, and I produce academic papers and books and stuff, but for I see the visual itself as a source of knowledge construction, which is as valid as other ways. And so that was a really big motivation for me. So it's I'm glad to sort of hear that in Felia's account as well.
And also I suppose just to go back to before Brittany intervenes, I think throughout this work, this comparative research I've done, for me, it's been important to spend time with the women. The 3 women whose stories, it's not just kind of, secondhand, it's actually spending a day with them to sort of, more an ethnographic type interview of sort of getting as close as you can to a certain extent. Obviously, we're all subjective researchers, there's no doubt about it. The material I presented to Anna was already my interpretation of but she also had the transcripts of the interviews and could take it from then, and we could then talk about it. But across all the research that I've done, I've always found that it's important to get as close and spend time and get a sense of, these women. Obviously, there are limitations. They tell you what they want you to hear and all this kind of stuff. Absolutely, no doubt about it. But also to get a sense of, who they are and where they're coming from. And that's why the human trafficking story, it was one of many stories that I was able to collect and spend time with various women in Italy who'd been trafficked into Italy. And hers was the more striking one because of her description of the madam, which for me was so rare, because obviously in other circumstances, women didn't want to acknowledge the role of the madam or who the madam was or the violence towards her, whereas she was really quite kind of concise and very clear about the woman, and also she gave agency to her, which I thought was also important, that she acknowledged that she had her own agency, and that's why that story was chosen. But coming back to a point that Brittany made earlier, I would love to go back and share these stories, but I have a difficulty in the sense that I fear that, in terms of the human trafficking one, I went back and said we've developed this, and we haven't actually gone back with the whole story. But I also sort of want to protect them, if that makes sense to a certain extent. I mean, the Italian story, her name was been completely changed. She did sign a consent form. She has had a documentary written about her, but I still wanted to sort of keep it sort of slightly anonymous to a certain degree, protect her rather than to protect me, but while acknowledging that it is a true story. They are her words. Her words have been used. As many of their words have been used as possible.
I was just going to piggyback on something that you said earlier, that about kind of the counter narratives. And I feel like, especially in the US context, and I know the UK a bit because we're starting to get some of your pop culture crime videos and all that trickling over here. And they're good. They're salacious and good. But our criminology students, for the most part, that is their sensationalized reality of crime and transnational crime and organized crime. What they see is what they believe. And then as academics, we have to counter that and say, well, that's not really, how it is, or here's something else. So I see these graphic novels as essentially counter narratives or counter graphic narratives to what they are already being, shown in pop culture. And I mean, even you can look at, especially, women criminals in the past, if you look at female pirates, I mean, they're sexualized, they're just not an accurate depiction of a female pirate. So I feel like these types of graphic narratives are going to be such powerful and useful academic tools, because the students and even, the faculty are already working kind of in this realm of visual counter visuals that we're having to combat daily. So Frederik, you're going to have to do a whole crime series now, just so you know. But it's there. And that's why I think this is going to be such an important tool in the classroom, and it's also accessible to the public. So I can't commend on how important this is, I think, to kind of telling the truth and telling the stories of these women. Because it sounds like, maybe you can speak to it more, you've touched on it a bit, like they want their reality shown from their perspective, not just someone coming in and saying, I think this is what's going on. I think that's how you're feeling and what you're doing.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm absolutely looking forward to your pirate comic. That sounds great. I hope that's coming along. But all right, we're just being reminded that we have 15 minutes left. But that is plenty of time for any questions from the floor.
Can I ask Felia a question?
Absolutely.
Would you do it again? Would you use this method again?
So my answer would be yes, but I think what I would do is I would factor in much more the I think when I promised this as part of the grant that I'm doing, I didn't realize how not expensive, but you have to pay an artist for their time and for their skill, and I think I'd underestimated that. So I think I would do it again, but I think I would factor it in much more into the grant than I did. I had started having to swap around my travel to the budget, and I promised a website which which I will probably end up doing as something, as a kind of some short podcasts, but I can do that free because my university has has a technician who's going to help me with that. So I would have factored that in. No, I think, yes, I would encourage, it's a lot of work. I think, I think perhaps in my faculty, it's still going to be dismissed as, something lightweight, when actually, when I go back and think about it, for me, it's the equivalent of a monograph. The whole process, the whole research, it's much more than just, writing and collecting material, because there's a whole process of, choice of words, choice of pictures, where does the nuance go? So it's much more important than a monograph in itself, because the whole process, you're very much more involved in it, and it does reflect your choices. Whereas, in an academic text, perhaps, you've got a chapter and you've given a subheading and the subheading isn't right. Well, people might not realize or pay attention to it as much as you do, because you know that you haven't gone back and changed it. Whereas here, I think that if you get a picture wrong, or if you get a kind of scene wrong, or I think I had a conversation recently with an expert on Albania, and he was sort of saying, in the story, I say that the majority of cocaine is imported into the UK by the Albanians, and he looked at me and I said, well, okay, we'll just leave it, because perhaps it's not, so the decisions and the kind of involvement, you immerse yourself in it much more. And I didn't think I'd realized that how that is going to, I didn't realize it was such a fully involved process. And as I say, there are, I can see around me, I have a colleague in my faculty where they had a lot of money, they did some research, they handed it over to a graphic or to a cartoonist who did a cartoon, and it's an excellent cartoon, but there wasn't that transfer of knowledge, there wasn't that co-production, which is the aspect that I wanted to highlight. It becomes, I don't want this to sound nasty, but it became more a kind of, economic transaction. Here's our research, you now do what you want. Whereas here, there was a dialogue, and it was a dialogue between two women of the same age, same ethnicity, talking about these and trying to unpack these very different, diverse and ethnic questions. So it was much more intense, rather than just saying, okay, you know what, here's my book, go and make a comic out of my book and just, make your own decisions. So it was much more, I didn't realize it was much more full on. I'm still, I'm really pleased with the result. I think the result speaks to a lot of different levels. But again, I don't know whether in my faculty, they'll look at it and they'll say, that's a monograph. They'll say, oh, it's just a little graphic. I don't know whether my faculty will have the capacity to recognize the worth that it is. 2 academic or 5 academic journals are better than this. And I feel that this is so much more. This is so much more than just 5 academic journals.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right that people do tend to underestimate just the amount of work that goes into producing these kinds of drawings, right? And it also speaks to what Kate was saying about drawing being part of the process of thinking through this material, right? And actually sort of sitting down and doing that. So it doesn't stop at the point, as you say, right, where like, okay, the research is done, now hand over, and it gets transparently sort of translated into like a graphic narrative, right? Like that's clearly not how it works. And it's very obvious from this work that you and Anna have really collaborated and that there's been a true sort of back and forth about how to present this in an accurate and respectful way. So yeah, I think those are all really good points.
And I think you're right that the idea of respect is important here as well, because there are so many sensitive issues, and I think that's right. Brittany talked about the juju, there's all these different kind of very delicate issues, not only around gender, but all the kind of ramifications around that, where you've got to be careful, with all these different kind of issues that could be problematic, but you've really got to think about it, because it can make a difference. Yeah,
thanks. Brittany.
I was just going to say, I would love to read an article on the methodology, this kind of collaborative graphic narrative and the ethics and the process and everything. I feel like that would be such an important contribution to get other scholars going on this type of research and kind of, talking about your challenges and the successes. And I feel like right there, just that conversation you had would be an incredibly impactful article that we can then start maybe. And then this would also shed some light on just how difficult this is and how it should be valued just as much as a monograph, if not more, because you're doing multiple things. You're doing art, you're doing scholarship, you're doing research, everything. But yeah, I do think we get change minds, and that's probably a good way to start.
Thanks, Brittany. Felia, is that something that is maybe in the pipeline?
No, that definitely is something to think about. Absolutely. Until I see the book in my hands, though, I'll still kind of, yeah. No, I think you're right. I think at the moment I've got another 9 months of free time before I go back to uni. So I'm definitely trying to concentrate on collecting more data and finish writing what I've promised. But I think you're right. I think. And I regret in a way perhaps not kind of having that parallel process or writing things down, at the time, because now going back, it's obviously kind of much more difficult to sort of unpick, more the challenges we had, the disagreements we had, because, Anna would go off and interpret something and then come back, and I would have to sort of say, no, that's just not right, that just doesn't work. Or there were words that were used and we sort of said, no, that wouldn't be used. So it was kind of, I think retrospectively, if I'd known now, I would have probably written it down and the article would have written itself, rather than now go back and say, right, okay, so what were the major challenges here, and where did we kind of disagree, or where didn't we disagree, or where, she went off and did all her own kind of research on Nigeria, and I got my colleagues who are Nigerians to give us photographs and to work all around that. And then we had friends in Castelvolturno, where the Nigerian cults are based, who took other photographs, and it was kind of a very intense kind of process. And I think that retrospectively now, it's just kind of a big massive kind of memories and positive ones, because we've managed to sort of get a book contract. But at the time, sometimes it was kind of quite stressful, and oh god, will this ever finish? Will we be able to, because the artwork is very special. I think it's very intense. I mean, Anna has given herself to that artwork. It's not just she's really thought about the detail of all of the stories, and they're all very different, and it's kind of it's very unique, I think, and it's sort of intense from that point of view. So yeah, no, maybe
yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why graphic narrative or comics tend to sort of be perhaps dismissed as research outputs, right? Because you don't see all that labor, right? You don't see all the visual reference research that you've been doing. You don't see all of that just sort of preparation, right? And then on top of that, you also tend to read these kinds of narratives much quicker than you read a monograph, right? So if you read a book like this in maybe 2 hours, you don't quite feel, perhaps, if you're not familiar with the form, you don't feel like you've sort of absorbed as much as you would have if you read a monograph, right? Or like your academic brain is not trained to sort of get the same kind of thing from it. But one of the things that the form really can do, right, is to sort of just visually underscore context and realities, right? So just simply by, I think, like drawing a background behind a character, right? Like that's not something you would ever really see or get a sense of in like a quote from an interview in a traditional monograph, right? And you can then also in this form, you can sort of keep insisting on that background if you want to insist in a specific context, right? Whereas in prose, you can't really do that. You can't say, oh, and the buildings were, I don't know, dilapidated in the background or whatever. Like, you can't sort of keep saying that. You maybe say that once, that, the context of this interview is this. But in graphic narrative, you can keep drawing that and really sort of underscore that particular context, that reality in a much more, I think, just powerful way than you can in traditional prose.
Absolutely.
Anyway, just some thoughts. Kate.
Yeah, just very quickly to say in response to both Brittany and Felia's points, I have forced myself, well, I didn't force myself, but just as I would aim to keep a kind of research journal if I'm doing a extended piece of research, I have now got into the habit of keeping I don't know what to call it, a drawing journal or a creative journal. I call what I do graphic social science. So I do kind of keep a track of what I'm doing, how it's going, how it feels, not in any kind of, a very, very regular way, but I do that, and it is resulting in, in blogs, in sort of journal articles, chapters, etc. Slowly. I've been doing it for about three years now, and it's taken a couple of years to get into the habit of that, but it's a really good habit to get into, to capture this, as you say, what Felia said, this kind of mass of blurred memory, really. So yeah, and
it's interesting because I think you need to get used to it. I mean, as somebody who studies a specific place, I study the Neapolitan mafia. I will go and I will do research, and I will walk around, and I will take notes, and I will go back and think about what I've happened, the conversations I've had, the kind of ethnographic stuff. So that's obvious to me. But here, recording the process of the graphic narrative wasn't an obvious thing. So my thoughts about walking around Naples and going into different places, I go home and then I write it down, and I kind of keep it safe. Whereas here, to have noted the kind of challenges, the difficulties, the changes and stuff like that, because it was the first time, it just didn't seem, and now it all makes sense to sort of say, you should have been doing that, you should have had a clear kind of, as I say, book with things saying, right, this happened, this didn't. So we learn all every day.
Yeah, exactly.
That might be a good note to end on. Thank you so much to Felia, Kate, and Brittany.
Thank you very much
for joining us today, and thanks also to everybody attending. And if anybody, if anybody's working on the project that could work as a comic, please do get in touch, and I'm happy to talk about that for the series. But thank you so much, everybody, and have a good rest of the conference, everybody.
Thank you for listening to the OC24 podcast. For more talks, have a look at the podcast feed on whichever platform you use. There are loads more to listen to. Video versions of these talks are also available on the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime YouTube channel. If you would like to share these talks around, we ask that you use the hashtag OC24 and let us know what you think. The 24-hour conference on global organised crime is brought to you by the European Consortium of Political Research Standing Group on Organised Crime, the Centre for Information and Research on Organised Crime, the International Association for the Study of Organised Crime, and the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. For more information, head over to oc24.globalinitiative.net. This has been the OC24 podcast from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. Thanks for listening.